Hello and welcome back to Writer's Ramble. I'm Deanna,
And I'm Michael.
and we're going to be talking more about writing and specifically the differences between how men and women tend to write stories.
So I am a man.
Now, I'm a woman.
Wait, really?
Yeah,
Ah, shoot.
last I checked.
It's been a while though, so I've forgotten. Okay, so the differences between sexes in writing. Um, you go first.
Needless to say, obviously, this isn't 100% the case for men and women. Obviously, there's going to be some women that write differently and men that write differently as well. Not sure if that really, if I'm making sense when I say that, but
But we're just talking about overall, stereotypical. What would, appeal more to women? What would appeal more to men? As a woman, how would you tend to write? As a man, how would I tend to write? Etc. Etc.
yeah, so it's kind of generalized, but just keep in mind it's gonna vary from person to person, of course. The obvious would probably be that women tend to focus most on emotion, and I would say that's probably pretty accurate. I mean, I like to write romance primarily, which means I like to focus on what the characters are feeling, and a lot of the drama that occurs in romance is usually emotion based. I mean, I still like sci fi and action things that happen, but I think I place higher importance on the inner turmoils of the characters and their inner demons, as you could say. And I feel like that's probably pretty common with the genre that I'm drawn to.
Right, yeah. And as a man, stereotypically the story would be focused on action, getting, fights maybe, or just like in general, something interesting happening, car chase, etc., etc. I feel like I'm not a stereotypical guy in that sense where that sort of stuff interests me as much. I do like action. I like watching fights and stuff, but I feel like the reason I like it is only if it in context makes sense and because that can really really heighten it for me. If there's not really good context to build up to that point, then it just feels like people punching each other for no reason.
Yeah, and that's not good either.
Yeah, because I feel like I'm not a huge action movie fan, partially because it feels like a lot of the time in action movies, it's a lot of fighting with not too much build up. It's like um, it's almost like they went about making the movie in such a way where it's like, okay, these are the action scenes we're gonna have. This is all the cool stuff that's gonna happen in this action movie, and then they like built the plot as basically a framing device for the action scenes. Right. I feel like in writing, it shouldn't feel like you're trying to make excuses to have something cool happen. It should just be a natural byproduct of the story that you're writing.
Yeah.
Likewise, I would say on, the more female end of things, when it comes to drama in stories and whatnot, I also enjoy drama in stories, but I same problem. If it doesn't have the context necessary, if it doesn't have the build up, and if it doesn't feel realistic, especially in drama for me, I feel like the drama, if it feels forced, just like if an action scene feels forced, I can't appreciate it as much or at all, as much because as a guy, I'm not into dramas as much as a girl would be. So I feel like I could appreciate the drama in something if it feels forced even less than I would maybe like an action scene because I may not be a stereotypical guy I feel like, but I still just like I could still enjoy some mindless action if it were put in front of me versus some needless drama maybe.
Yeah, and I mean, drama can definitely have instances where it feels melodramatic and it just feels more pathetic than anything. Even though I really love romances, I feel like the drama just has to happen for a good reason. Like, I'm definitely not a fan of really pointless drama that happens in certain romances where maybe I'm trying to think of a good example.
I can think of an example, but you wouldn't like it.
Well, now I'm curious.
What do you think?
Does that have something to do with Twilight?
It has something to do with Twilight,
Of
yeah.
course. Was it something you felt like it could have been very easily avoided?
uh, it's not so much that, like, it's Twilight is just melodramatic by nature, in my opinion. Um, where what's actually happening in the story, it is based around drama, but it's not as dramatic, I feel like, as the story makes it seem like to me. So, like, all of it, in a way, feels melodramatic just because, yes, it is based around drama, but they're overreacting to a lot of things a lot of the time, just consistently throughout the story, which I guess props for having a consistent tone, but the tone is one that I don't appreciate.
Except I feel like a lot of the reasons, like the characters, the way how they reacted, anyways, felt warranted to me if you looked at each situation. That's my opinion. An unpopular one I'm aware of, but you know, we've all got our guilty pleasures. But I guess getting back to what I was gonna discuss, I think it's rather upsetting if maybe there's a couple and they have an argument or a misunderstanding or something occurs that could have been very easily avoided, especially if they were just willing to just communicate. And then there's like this big drama that blows up, and maybe it even drags out, like maybe it's the main plot. And that's really frustrating for me. And it's like this could have been easily avoided if they had just been a real couple and just talked things through.
Yeah, I'll definitely agree with you on that one, where I think that if it's a situation that could have easily been avoided with just a little bit better communication, that's, as an audience member, like, I know what they're going for as the writers. They're trying to create conflict. Stories are based around conflict. There's usually conflict and resolution, and that's like the emotional reward for having gone through this story. So I can see why, on a surface level, it would look like, ah, yes, just give them some conflict, any conflict, as long as it's, there. But as an audience member, and I understand that some people don't necessarily feel this way. Some people might just be alright with any conflict. They just want something to happen. But for me, I guess maybe I'm picky. Especially as a guy, I feel like I'm picky about these sorts of things because it's not necessarily my genre of choice to begin with. But if it feels like it's just like it could be very easily avoided if they just talked about it, it's more annoying than anything to watch them go through all these things, to jump through all these hoops trying to sort this thing out, and it becomes a big plot point, and it becomes a big deal when a few words would have solved it. Because, again, I just find it annoying because it's something very simple, and the writers usually know that it's simple. It's just it's almost a trope in its own sense because this happens in a lot of different things I can think of, and I feel like it's a bad trope. It's just it's something that as an audience member, it's not rewarding to see. It's not interesting really either because you know how they could fix it. You know how they're probably gonna fix it once they get to that point. It's just prolonging getting to that point through plot contrivance, which is not fun, and it's not fun to watch, and I don't understand why they do it.
Yeah, and normally it's something I'm not a fan of either. However, I think there are some instances where it's executed in a good way, and I'm thinking of like Pride and Prejudice because it's centered around a misunderstanding between the two main characters when you really think about it, because Elizabeth, she views Mr. Darcy as being very pompous and, rich guy asshole. And Mr. Darcy thinks she probably would just want him for his money like a lot of other women, but as they get to know each other and they butt heads a lot. They start to realize that there's a lot more to them. Sorry. As they get to know each other, they eventually come to understand that there's a lot more to them than that, and there was a lot of just miscommunication. And I felt like it was done in a way, it felt real because there are a lot of miscommunications that happen in real life, but I think the way they executed it was good.
I would agree, but I feel like they also have the benefit in that story of they don't actually know each other yet. They're like getting to know each other
Yeah.
as the story goes on, and the fact that like they it's actually sort of the opposite of uh, a bad miscommunication type drama. So if anything, I think this is proving my point because the fact that they don't know each other is kind of everything. Once they get to know each other better, they start to understand why they're actually sort of a good match instead of just being upset at each other the whole time. Because once they understand who the true person is, they start to understand that they start to fall in love, etc., etc. Whereas the ones that are the worst, I feel like, are when it's an already established relationship,
Oh, yeah.
and yeah, yeah. I'm sorry, I'm kind of like sorry. I'm gonna have to restart that. When it's an already established relationship, and they have this sort of miscommunication, drama, plot point, it's usually, personally speaking, and this is an assumption on my end, but I feel like it's a safe assumption to make. It's usually when the writers have sort of run out of other ideas to do with the characters, because if there's one major and if there's one natural and major problem with romance stories, it's that it's very hard to continue a romance story after they're together, because what kind of conflict is there after that point, right? If the entire thing is structured around it being a romance, then like logically the end of that should be they ended up together happily ever after. And there are some stories that like continue the plot on in various ways, in good ways, to make it like a really good, interesting story based around this couple. But like other things are happening. But that's kind of the thing. Other things are happening. It's maybe not so much focused on them falling in love anymore, so much as them trying to maintain their relationship while the stuff's going on. I've never watched this myself, but what comes to mind is like Outlander.
I was actually going to mention Outlander, and frankly, I haven't actually read the novels, but my mother has been reading it pretty much ever since they came out, and I've heard all my life from my mom would talk about various things that happen in the series, and even though I haven't actually read it just yet, but I'm planning to read it, I already appreciate a lot of the different elements I've heard about it, and I think one of the main messages is marriage is really just the beginning of the story, and I think that's a really good message that we don't hear often enough. And I think that's actually a lot more romantic than they just lived happily ever after, because there's so many other things that happen in life after getting married.
Yeah, and I do think that's a good like life lesson to learn, a good moral to the story. However, talking about most stories though, they can't have that because a romance tends to be they're falling in love. It's about that. But I feel like in the hands of bad writers, or maybe just writers that don't know exactly what to do with these good characters that they have once they are together, it can end up in a situation where they have this sort of miscommunication dilemma. And I think that's one of the worst ways to do it, because then you take these characters who you already know are supposed to be together. They ended up together at the end of maybe the last movie or whatever, and now all of a sudden they're having these problems. I understand that fights are a thing that happen in a relationship, and there is miscommunication in relationships, but that doesn't make for a good story, I don't think. Because as a perceptive audience member, I feel like you would just know that they're gonna end up together. It's just an artificial prolonging of their story just so that you can have something that they're doing in this movie. The best example I can think of is what happened between Anna and Kristoff in Frozen 2. A lot
Oh
of
yeah,
people,
I didn't like that.
yeah, a lot of people hated that part of the movie because Anna and Kristoff were a pretty good couple from the first movie, and then all of a sudden literally they were having miscommunication. It wasn't just that like they said something mean to each other and they were upset with each other. They literally couldn't understand what the other one was saying half the time, and that just led to many moments where like they're all having this like these sad dramatic feelings over what essentially it boils down to Kristoff just kept botching trying to ask Anna to marry him, and that's like their entire plot for the entirety of the second movie. Any other plot point in that movie was decent to pretty dang good, but that one was just like, I feel bad because I like Kristoff as a character, and he just had hardly anything to do in that movie except try and fail to marry Anna until the very end of the movie. And you can just tell that it was like they were like dragging that out until the very end of the movie because what else was he supposed to do? They just couldn't think of anything else for him to do.
Yeah, the writers are like, let's just give him like a random 80s solo, like in the woods.
Ironically enough, that the song in particular having to do with Kristoff in that movie was something that was rather divisive because some people really loved that and some people thought that that was like weird.
I was kind of with the latter in that case. I thought it was weird. I was
Which that in itself is somewhat ironic because you tend to love 80s music.
well, in that case, I didn't like how it was executed because I was mostly wondering like what the hell is happening right now. I started thinking maybe I was hallucinating.
And I feel like you can have something like that in a movie and pull it off, and it could be more funny than anything, and people would appreciate it for that reason. I guess it was just executed in just such a way that a lot of people seem to have mixed feelings about it in that movie. Personally speaking, I thought that it was just kind of like, personally speaking, I just tend to love things that are unexpected.
It was
Not
pretty.
not just for the sake of shock value, but like if it feels like it fits, and this didn't necessarily feel like it felt. This didn't necessarily feel like it fit, but if a story can go away from my expectations, if it can take me away from what I was expecting, even if it doesn't necessarily always fit the best, it always interests me at the very least. Because if a movie is just full of tropes and just things that I already basically know are going to happen because I've seen a movie like that before, it can be very boring. So something unexpected like that can spice it up. It can also make it worse. But at the very least, like even bad movies can be fun to watch if they're interesting because of those reasons. There are plenty of movies that are so bad they're good simply because all these like WTF things are happening to the point where you're like, I didn't expect this to happen, which kind of gives it some entertainment value.
That's kind of how I feel about Dracula 2000 because it was just such an unusual twist that for me actually it made it better. But I don't know, I feel like that in particular, you either really enjoy the twist or you just go, what the fuck?
Personally, I thought that that twist was interesting. They actually did do a lot of good things in that movie when it comes to twists. They gave you hints about it. It was pretty obvious in like hindsight, and it happened at a pretty good moment in the movie. So I feel like they did do the twist good. I would say that the movie overall seems like it had a pretty small budget. It seems like they didn't super know what they wanted the movie to be aside from that twist. But it was a pretty good twist nonetheless. So, I mean, I'll give it that. I still wouldn't rate the movie very highly, but I'll give it that.
I mean, it's definitely campy, I would say. Campy for sure, but I just appreciated the twist. And it's one of those guilty pleasures I watch every Halloween and kind of laugh at a lot of things that I'm not sure if they're supposed to be funny necessarily, but I do anyways. It's just one of those movies for me. But Um, I was gonna say something about Kristoff and I forgot. Had something to do with their relationship.
What did you think of their relationship in the first Frozen movie?
Um, I liked it because, it's kind of like showing. Well, I think what I really liked about it is, Anna was set on uh,
Mary Hans.
Hans.
You forgot his name.
I almost said Han, and I was like, that's not right.
She wanted to marry Han Solo.
Well, that's a lot of girls. But, they were obviously pushing, they were trying to get the audience to ship her and Hans, of course, so that they could rip out everyone's heart at the end. But I liked that she was really set on that as well, and it definitely head over heels, and they seemed like a really good match. But then you see her with Kristoff, who's kind of the opposite, and at first rather kind of disgusting to her. But I think it's interesting to see how sometimes the person you're meant to be with is not who you originally anticipated, and I think that's a really nice message in itself. And it's kind of like, it's almost like going outside your comfort zone, giving other people a chance. Oh, I can't talk. It's like giving other people a chance and just getting to know them better, and I just think it was a good message in that sense. And I think they make a good kind of like a contrasting couple, like the opposites attract type thing, but in a healthy way, I would say. So that's what I liked about it.
And I would say, I feel like a lot of people have said this over the years, but I do appreciate how Disney sort of acknowledged the fact that basically throughout their entire history of Disney princess films, the princess has fallen head over heels for the first guy she meets, and they're happily engaged and happily ever after by the end of the movie, even though, again, like, they've known each other for a day or so. And I think it was cool that Elsa was like, oh, you don't know this guy. You've only met him, like, tonight. And she's like, yeah, but I want to marry him anyway. And then, like, it turns out that's a bad idea at the end. I would, praise Disney for that if I felt like they shouldn't have done that, like, a long time ago. Like, it feels like they finally got around to it, but it took them way too long. Because, like, honestly, Disney's been around forever, and they've made all sorts of animated movies, but even so, going so far back as, like, Cinderella, like, it was already at that point, I feel like, kind of strange that she just met the prince that she doesn't even know the name of at that ball.
I don't think he has a name.
I don't think he has a name.
He's just rich prince guy.
Yeah.
What more do you need to know?
Maybe, I don't know, anything at all. I don't know if they even talked, they just danced.
He's really interested in feet.
Oh yeah, there we go. Something interesting about him finally. But I mean, obviously that was an old movie. I feel like you can let that slide a bit because that's an old movie. But like looking back on it, and just like all of the movies that came out over the next like 50 years or so, it took until 2011 for them to finally acknowledge that as like a thing.
Was that 2011?
I think 2011 was when the first Frozen came out.
Huh. That was actually kind of a while back, wasn't it?
Yeah, 9 years ago now.
Time flies.
Time flies when you're in quarantine. Or really it doesn't. But anyway, so I feel like in a way Disney's almost gotten too much praise for that, because it's like that, yes, it's nice that they finally acknowledged it, but it almost feels like, why didn't you get to this before you actually did, like 20 years before you actually did?
I just wanted to add, when you really think about it, I was just thinking of your comment with Cinderella, and it made me think, she it kind of feels like her main goal in the whole movie. I mean, you could tell, obviously, she didn't like her circumstances, how she was being treated at home. But her main dream was like to go to the ball and stuff, wasn't it? I think she mostly just wanted to go and have fun. I don't think she was actually necessarily looking for a prince. She just wanted to have, a fun girls' night out. And
Didn't she get lucky?
yeah, she really got lucky. And so I don't like it when people say like, "Oh, Cinderella is about getting a man to save you," because she like never actually said anything about that. She's like, "Oh, I just want to have a fun night, that's all." And it's like, well, I can appreciate that.
Well, I can see where they're coming from because it's like, oh, it's not about getting a man to save you because she never wanted that. But the thing is, if the prince hadn't, fallen in love with her or anything, at the end of the movie, she still would have been under, the thumb of her stepmother. So it really wouldn't have been a good ending without the prince.
Yeah, and I've also heard an interesting take, because I feel like it's pretty obvious to say that she was in an abusive environment, and
No. It's like, yeah, my stepdad beats me all the time. That's normal.
I feel like it's not overly obvious for me to actually state that for some people who maybe don't realize that certain things are not normal. The way how she's being treated at home. It was definitely abuse, and some people are like, that's normal. No, it's not. I heard an interesting take where some people were discussing her obvious situation where she's in an abusive environment, and it was just interesting because they were explaining, especially people who have been in that same type of situation, they'd maybe have that fantasy of being rescued, or maybe they feel like they don't have the strength to get out on their own. And I think other people that haven't been in that situation are more frustrated with Cinderella, where it's like, oh, well, you shouldn't be dealing or putting up with all this nonsense, but we didn't grow up in that situation like her, so we don't have that same mentality. She just feels lucky that she has a roof over her head. And on top of that, in her time period, there really wasn't any other option for her. She didn't have like any other family she could be with, and women really just didn't fend well on their own back in that time period. So I kind of get where they're coming from, and I think that kind of makes the whole message of Cinderella very different, where people who did grow up in an abusive environment looked at Cinderella as like a hopeful story where maybe they could also be saved from this toxic situation. And I think that's maybe a better way to look at it rather than just, oh, she's just a lady trying to get a man to save her.
But I mean, it is different nowadays.
Yeah.
A woman doesn't necessarily have to stay with family or whatever. She's not entirely dependent upon that sort of thing these days. So the point still could be argued that it's not a good message to teach kids these days, especially if they are in an abusive situation, because that only reinforces their thinking like, oh, I need someone to come save me. I can't do anything myself. So if they already feel that way, they're just going to feel that way more. They're going to want someone else to save them more after watching Cinderella. So I would still kind of argue that that's not the best thing to give people these days, because even women these days, they can fend for themselves better.
I mean, yeah, I agree with that too. I think if you're looking if you're looking at specifically Cinderella's situation, it was a different time period. And so in that case, it wouldn't have made sense for her to just run off on her own. But I mean, nowadays, yeah, it wouldn't be a good message for modern day women because it is easier to get away from that type of situation. Not saying it's easy necessarily. I mean, from my perspective, it seems like it would be just because I have just a different mentality. I didn't grow up in a situation like that. But I feel like it's a lot harder for people that did grow up in an abusive situation. I don't know what I'm saying anymore.
I got stuck in that argument. I can't think of something new to say now.
So how about that weather?
Man, it is so weathery.
It seems like earlier I was gonna mention something about I had something I was gonna say about like some of the other Disney princesses. I lost it.
So I mentioned, well, I kind of mentioned because you mentioned certain things that like don't make as much sense in terms of drama. Is there like are there tropes when it comes to action movies and stuff that like bother you because you just don't get them as much because you're a girl? And like it would make a little bit more sense to a guy because it's just like this is what I want to watch, but to you, you're just like this is dumb and weird.
Yes.
What is it?
The first one that came to mind is various action movies, and I can't think of like a specific one off the top of my head, but they might have it might be like a group of guys like they're all on a mission and they'll have like one girl on the team that's supposed to be like a tomboy type, but she's also, just meant to be eye candy, and maybe they're off gonna do something. Well, now I'm thinking of like zombie apocalypse type situation where like they should be wearing clothing that's covering them pretty well to avoid like scrapes and getting bitten and other things like that. But the girl's running around in like a tank top and it's like low cut, or maybe she's like in short shorts and like high heels. It's like what's going on? It's like this isn't practical.
You're thinking of Misty from Zombies, aren't you?
I hated her. She made no sense to me.
Yeah, Misty from Call of Duty Black Ops 2 Zombies. Uh, she was a character that I don't love myself because she's pretty one note, and we mentioned in the last podcast why one note characters are just the worst. um, but yeah, I also have to agree with you. I, as a man, can see why they would do that, obviously. As they say in Hollywood, sex sells. But, and I can see why it would work more for men, but, I think if we're talking about good writing, it would be best, if you're gonna have the eye candy, at least, give it a good reason, an excuse, if you will. I feel like you shouldn't have to be making excuses to throw in eye candy like that. Throw in some women wearing like bras or something and nothing else. But like at the very least, if you're trying to go for good writing, at least try to like make it as natural as possible. I feel like having women just show up practically naked isn't very common and isn't a thing that you should just throw in for no reason. But if you're going for that, just try to make it as natural as possible. That's like trying to tell Michael Bay not to put explosions every 5 seconds, but try your best.
Try to restrain yourself from doing that.
Yeah, if you're making an action movie script, obviously there's got to be action. Probably because it's geared towards men, there's going to be some half naked ladies. But at least try to make it practical. At least try to make it make sense within the story. A good example of this, I feel like, is you've seen the Jumanji reboot, right?
Well, I've seen the first one. I haven't seen. There was a new one that came out.
Yeah, I'm talking about the first one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember her name. Oh, Roundhouse Ruby, I think was her name. The character's name.
Karen Gillan.
Yeah, Karen Gillan. She is wearing a super skimpy outfit. Although to be fair, like it makes sense, like with the location that they're at because it's warm. So she would be wearing a skimpier outfit.
I feel like
also, she was wearing boots. Sorry, I'm not trying to stop you, but she was wearing boots. And then third and the most important, I would say, is that everything that doesn't make sense, I feel like it's not a good excuse for everything in the movie, but for the vast majority of things that didn't make sense, I feel like they had a decent explanation, which is they're in a video game. Doesn't necessarily have to make sense if it's in a video game to real life.
I was just gonna say, I don't really remember her outfit being skimpy. I mean, it was like, I think she was like in a tank top and shorts and stuff, but.
It showed her midriff, I
Uh,
think. And
Whore.
also, obviously, and also the shorts were pretty short.
Oh.
And you can tell like throughout the movie, they like her character is supposed to be. I think literally like the byline for her character description was like seducer of men or something like that. She's supposed to be like the sexy type character,
Hmm.
but that's like kind of the thing in the story of the video game, which plays with like the fourth wall breaks a whole lot. um, they acknowledge that she's like a sexy type character, so they have her wearing sexy attire in the video game. And it doesn't necessarily detract from the movie because they acknowledge it, and honestly, they play with like the trope of the sexy type character a lot because um, the character, the human character from the real life in the movie, I know that's kind of complicated. She is like a nerd type. So
Mm-hmm.
like you have this very awkward energy coming from what you would stereotypically expect to be, like the confident, self-assured, sexy type character, which is kind of a breath of fresh air. Again, that's just something that sort of subverts your expectations that I personally appreciate. I can recognize that the video game uh, explanation isn't perfect, and it can sort of be like a plot contrivance at points. Anything and everything that doesn't make sense being explained through it's a video game, while it's like interesting and cool about half the time, the other half of the explanations, I feel like it just shouldn't have been relied on as heavily as it was. I can understand that um, complaint. And then also, another complaint is, especially in the sequel to that reboot, they said like they played with the idea of people from the real world being in these avatars that don't really fit their personality. They played with that a little bit more, but they almost a lot of critiques I've seen have almost wondered if that's like something stale and that shouldn't have been the thing that's like carrying the movie for two different movies. If that's like the main thing carrying two different entire movies, then it starts to get old at that point.
Yeah, because I think in certain cases, you don't want to repeat that too much, it just gets stale. And granted, I haven't seen the second one, but I was pleasantly surprised with how funny this remake was with the
Mm-hmm.
first one. I was a little skeptical that maybe it wouldn't have been all that great. Like, I thought maybe in the trailers we saw, like, all the funniest parts and that would be it. But I felt like the movie all the way through was actually really funny. And while I haven't seen the second one, I almost kind of got the feeling that maybe it just wasn't gonna be the same as the first one. Like a lot of films, really. Usually the first ones are the best, and the second ones are. You have that risk that it might not be as great, but that was just the impression that I got.
To be fair to the second one, frankly, I was against the idea of a reboot of Jumanji in the first place, but considering that they were going for a tone and a story entirely different than the original movie, I was far more alright with it when I actually did watch the movie than I expected to be. And upon watching it, I appreciate it for what it was, and I think it was genuinely a pretty good movie. And then the sequel came along, and I again was worried of sequelitis. It's gonna be worse than the reboot, which some people arguably think that the reboot is worse than the original. I'd probably be among them just because I like how uh, interesting and dark potentially and just like emotional the original got in comparison to the reboot. But again, I appreciate the reboot for it being its own thing. The sequel to the reboot, though, I was still actually pleasantly surprised at how good it was. I do feel like it's not as good as the original reboot, because for the reasons that I said, um, you know, the sort of trope at that point of characters not be in the video game, not being who they are in real life, being sort of the opposite, became kind of old. And you can kind of tell that they knew that it was getting old by the second one, because in the second one they had many situations where characters would actually swap avatars with other characters. So all of a sudden, Karen Gillan isn't like the nerd anymore. She's being played by some other real life person. And like that made things kind of interesting. But then, but when you start doing that, you have to realize that this thing that you have from the original, if you have to do that, you must realize that the thing you had going for you in the original is kind of getting old. If you have to start doing those somewhat gimmicky things. And then on top of that, I would just say that the other thing that the sequel sort of did that I feel like lets it down a little bit is they introduced a lot of new characters, and some of them are pretty good. I really love Danny DeVito's character, just whoever was playing as him, who he was in the real world in the movie. Just Danny DeVito's a great actor, and I just like love his character in that movie. It was super funny. But he wasn't the only new character. There was another old man, and then there was like a friend that I think showed up from the first one, and then there was like two or three other people, if I'm thinking correctly, that just kind of appeared. And I don't know, I think that there was just one or two too many characters. They were balancing the plots of the original characters and then trying to add in some new ones, and I think they did pretty good. I think that you can tell that the spirit of the original reboot and the writers probably were some of the same, if not most of the same. It's just that you can tell that it was getting a little old at that point, and I really feel like one of the worst ways of spicing up a sequel is to throw in new characters willy-nilly. So if I had any nitpicks, it'd probably be that. I recognize that I spoke for far too long, but hey, that's rambling. I'm a writer, I'm rambling. That's what this show is.
Don't you know you can't do that?
You're right, I'm sorry. I'll go sit in the corner now. Think about what I've done.
Good. But yeah, I'd say that's a turnoff for me as well when the writers introduce, especially if it happens all at once, like a whole slew of frickin' characters, and it makes me think of Patrick. Like, who are these people? Because that's just frustrating where there's like 20 people, and it's like, oh, this is Jim, this is Joe, this is Jimmy, and and it's just, I don't like that. Because then, like, when you're reading it or watching it, it's like you, whoever the fuck you are.
Yeah, because then you end up with a Hobbit situation where it's like Feely, Keely, Dwalin, Ballin, Beefer, Bofer, Biffer. By the way, these are all real characters.
No, I know. That's just, I don't know. To me, that almost makes me kind of mad in a way. It's like, why the fuck did you do this? It's like, I'm not remembering all these people, and it kind of also, this is a little off topic, but also makes me think if you pick a really complicated name for your character, and it might be like a fantasy novel, and the name is, there's no fucking way I'm gonna be able to figure out how to pronounce this name, so every time I read it, I just skim over it like, blah, blah, blah. And I never actually learn how to say their name.
Or if you have this very fantasy-looking name with all these apostrophes and, special symbols, like it's got an I with the 2 dots over it instead of 1.
Yeah,
but
like a hashtag in there.
Maybe you got a special symbol, an ampersands or a hashtag. But ultimately when you read it out, if you pronounce it correctly, you find out that it sounds pretty close to just like a real name. Like it looks like Andrew, but like when you read it out, you sort of recognize that it's just like a funny way of spelling Andrew.
It's like, gee, maybe you should have just named him Andrew.
Well, that's not fantasy enough.
Man, this probably makes me look really judgmental, but I'll be honest, I've done this before. Sometimes I've picked up a book, and if the character had too much of a weird fucking name, I just put it back.
Wow.
It's just really annoying to me. If it's like a really weird name, it's like, why? Because it feels like they're just trying to be like, ooh, I'm unique. I picked a unique name for them. And it's like, I'm actually annoyed now. It probably makes me sound really judgmental, but that's just how I feel.
I mean, I would say if you're not into that sort of thing, that can be a pretty good indication of this is not the type of story that I want. Because there are definitely stories, especially in fantasy, that, um, they go head first into the deep end of fantasy. Heavy world building. They got the crazy names. They got, intricate explanations of how the magic works. They've got a history of every single race that has existed on that world. Silmarillion levels of this has, world building, which I feel like is what fantasy does best. And if you see a character whose name reflects how, hard they go with the fantasy aspect of it, you might recognize that that's just something that you wouldn't be into, because I know that that's something that you're not into, and so you'd probably be in for a world of like back in the age of man, in the world of Shifrafia, near the village of Tengswar, there lived a man named Kyong Qing Shantu. And you're like,
Lived,
huh?
lived a man named Joe.
Joe? Dude, I'd read something like that. Like, just for the fact that his name is Joe. Like, if it was a pretty normal guy and he ended up on some high stakes fantasy adventure in this world that is like built up as much as that would be so funny. I'd be willing to read a little bit of that. And I feel like that's probably been done before, because hey, what hasn't been done? But I mean, if anyone knows something like that, I'd be down to read a bit of something like that.
Yeah, because it's definitely not what you're expecting going into it.
Yeah.
And, oh, I just wanted to say, it's probably obvious, but I'm not super huge into the fantasy genre in general. I like Legend of Zelda, and I feel like that's like the one exception for me. It's like, I could play Zelda for hours, but then when it comes to other fantasy type stories, I'm just not wild about it. And I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe a part of me almost has trouble taking certain things seriously. I'm more of a sci-fi person, but
Which, the definition of sci-fi is...
no, I know what you're gonna say, and I'm not talking about my story. I'm not talking about that, because
Okay.
I know that's not sci-fi. I'm just saying in
I'm
other
just
cases.
wondering, because you say you do like sci-fi,
Yeah,
but like what sci-fi thing have we actually even watched together?
Doctor Who.
Okay, besides that.
We've watched. Well, let me think about it for a second here. I'm trying to think. Since the quarantine happened, we've watched a lot of things, really.
Because, like, if I think of sci-fi, like, Back to the Future comes to mind.
Yeah, and I like Back
Minority
to the Future.
Report, iRobot, which, plenty of people don't like that movie. I actually have read the original iRobot short stories, and they're fantastic, especially in comparison to the movie, but that's, sci-fi. That's something that's very sci-fi. All those things come to mind for me, but I feel like you haven't watched anything like those other ones. You've seen Doctor Who, but that's like one of the few that I can think of that is very inherently sci-fi that I know that you've seen.
I kind of wonder, like, what would Marvel fall under? Because, I mean, there's...
Superhero.
Well, I know that, obviously, but...
I mean, it is sci-fi.
Because you got, like, time travel and all that stuff, too.
It is sci-fi, but it's sci-fi is definitely the subgenre in those movies over the much larger umbrella of superhero, which includes some fantasy elements, some sci-fi elements, some, it's got elements of quite a lot of things, honestly. especially in the MCU, there's also elements of comedy and stuff. So you can't just say that it's sci-fi. It technically is, but that's like what isn't, under the genre of superhero under the right context. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I feel like I just enjoy a lot of time travel type stories, and I know they don't always technically fall under sci-fi, but I'm just a sucker for time travel related stuff.
So it's not so much sci-fi, but time travel that gets your goat.
It's just really fascinating, and I don't know, it just makes the plot really interesting. I think the more complicated it gets, the more interested I am, weirdly enough.
Uh, I feel like I'm with most people when I say, especially when it gets super complicated in time travel. That's, and this is my own personal opinion, so take it with a grain of salt. I just think that that is an indication of bad writing when it's very, very complicated when having to do with time travel because, well, first of all, it has to be understandable through the audience. And time travel is one of those concepts that's really interesting to write about, but you can do it wrong in so many different ways. I think the best example I can come up with off the top of my head for just like really awful use of time travel in stories is almost any Terminator film after the second one because of how many times it gets retconned, how many times like things are changed, and you have a lot of very logical questions in your brain that it never gets answered, or it's just answered in a bad way, or the explanation that they give is not one that makes any sense if you think about it for more than 2 seconds. Um, it's just a bit of a mess when it comes to time travel. I so consistently think of time travel movies and I think, wait, this is a paradox, this is a paradox, this is a paradox, and I just can't even wrap my brain around it. I recently watched the movie Tenet.
I was just thinking of that actually, because I was like, you liked that one, didn't
I
you?
did like that one, but it was full of paradoxes as well. Like that one was just interesting, I think, in the way that they went about the mechanic of time travel, but I'm not going to pretend that it made all the sense in the world. As a matter of fact, I'm still rather confused on quite a few plot points. It does make a bit more sense than other time travel films because I think they put a lot of time and thought into it. However, there are definitely certain aspects of it that I think no matter how much thought you can put into it, just don't make sense. So, I mean, it's a good movie, in my opinion, but it, like almost any other story revolving around time travel, has its logical fallacies. Um, and I think the more complicated you make it when it comes to time travel, the more logical fallacies start building up.
Yeah, and I feel like I've mentioned before, I feel like I'm a little bit lenient in certain cases, like if I were to grade movies or books or whatever, and maybe there's something that doesn't make a ton of sense. If it's small enough, I might just kind of brush it off as be like, oh, well, so maybe they screwed up a little bit with this thing, but the rest of it was good, but it also depends, because I feel like some things, if you just refuse to acknowledge something, or if the explanation is too lousy, then I get upset, and it it always makes me think of a story I read, and I won't get into all of it, all the details. Frankly, it was a fan fiction that I read, but it also dealt with time travel, and it was a situation where a character that had been gone for a while came back, and the girl asked him, like, oh, where have you been this whole time? And he's like, it doesn't matter. All it matters is I'm here now. And I got really pissed off when I read that. So you gotta be kidding me.
Yeah, and you know what? If I were to read a story like that, and the writing indicated that there would be some payoff as to that plot point later on, and then they didn't give me that payoff, I'd be pissed too. That's something that annoys me about writing sometimes. I think of Nazi zombies in particular,
Uh,
actually.
you know, that I have mixed feelings because I feel like Nazi zombies, like the storyline was a lot more complex than it needed to be, and in the beginning, I actually kind of liked that because they took like a simple concept and made it really deep and interesting. And at first, I really appreciated that, but then it just started going too far, and then it's like, okay, this is getting a little
I
ridiculous. But
think I think in many ways it was always too far, but it didn't take itself too seriously at first. Um, but then people started getting invested in it, and Activision and the people working on it, they realized that people were getting invested, so they wanted to make a serious story out of it. But with all the discordant plot points, even just from the very beginning, it was never meant to be a story from the very beginning. As a matter of fact, Nazi Zombies was not even a mode in the game World at War until like very late in development, because I think like the developers noticed that people had implemented this mode and they were just playing it on their off time because it was fun for them, and so they like added it into the game at the last second because it was just like a fun little thing that they could add. And then ever since then it's become this huge thing. But uh, because there was no story in mind when they started it, and because in the beginning when they did have a story, they didn't give it very much credit. They didn't give it very much emotional, or like even just in terms of the plot itself, they didn't care much for continuity or anything like that. They just wanted interesting locales, interesting things to happen, and they alluded to certain mysteries within it. But I think that they never really had solid answers for any of that. They just thought that that'd be an interesting thing to add, and it was. However, eventually people did get invested in all that, and so they wanted these answers. And I think at some point, the people making these must have realized, oh no, they actually want answers. We never intended to give them these answers. And so like they scrambled to try, especially in Black Ops 3, I think, to give those answers, or to at least form a story around these new characters where they could give some potential answers, kind of, sort of. But the entire process, I think, was just so much of a mess that even when they tried, rather half-heartedly, I would say, to give some sort of, emotional reward, some sort of payoff for all these little different mysteries that people have been trying to solve for years and years, it was just never enough. It was not something that actually felt rewarding if you were paying attention to all these little plot points. It was just kind of, really? Really, that's the ending? And I stopped paying attention to the plot after Revelations in 3, so I honestly don't know what's happened since then. I know there has been more DLC, but frankly, I'm not interested because that was such a letdown of an ending that I feel like Activision just hasn't had my trust in like making good, story beats for zombies, and so I've given up on that sort of.
for our listeners that are very confused right now that don't play video games, we were talking about a video game from Call of Duty. I just wanted to specify
Did I
that.
never mention
I
that?
don't think you did. So I kind of just thought it would have been better if they made it a separate game, but a better plot.
I just feel like they'd have to scrap any plot that they had up to that point and just make an entirely new plot, maybe loosely around based on what they already had, if they wanted to make a good plot at all. Frankly, I just don't think that Call of Duty and the writers working for Call of Duty have the writing chops to do it justice, frankly.
Ouch.
I mean, no offense, but like, when was the last time anybody actually remembered, seriously, like any plot point at all of any Call of Duty game that they played? I don't think that's what anybody playing Call of Duty is there for.
I'm just there to shoot 'em up.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, the campaigns in Call of Duty games got so irrelevant to the point where Black Ops 4 does not have a campaign.
That's just, like, sad.
Yeah, but that's kind of my point. Nobody is there for the plot of the campaign specifically in a Call of Duty game. They're there for the online multiplayer and maybe also zombies. Um, but you know what I've said about zombies and the shortcomings of their story. I think that if they really wanted to make zombies into something great, I think the gameplay's there. They gotta get better writers.
You know what I find really interesting with Call of Duty, especially the Nazi zombies, is, um, sorry. But I think what's really interesting is everyone fell in love with the main crew, as they would often refer to them as. The main four characters you could play as: Richtofen, Nikolai, Dempsey, and Takeo. And what I think is interesting is while everyone loved them, they're just like the most cliche stereotypes. And I feel like in any other case, whether it be like a novel or movie or show or whatever, usually stereotypes, there'd be an out. I can't talk. Usually with stereotypes in any other stories, people would be just outraged if you just did a very cliche stereotype, but in Nazi zombies, it was weirdly endearing, and I want to know how they got away with that.
I feel like the characterization of the characters, because zombies is almost entirely gameplay. There's hardly any cutscenes. There's very little outside of the actual gameplay itself. So in order for the characters to stand out at all, they had to make them very, very, very bombastic and just stand out in their own right. And what easier way and what better way to do that than to just like take all the stereotypes that these different types of people are already known for and just like crank that up to 10. I think that the fact that they did, crank that up to 10 made for such interesting characters that are like just crazy that it was just like so entertaining that because they're stereotypes, like you'd think that people would get offended, but they're such caricatures of those stereotypes that even if you were, let's say like a Japanese person or no, actually that's a bad example. Even if you were an American, red-blooded, country loving,
Patriotic.
bald eagle, owning a bald eagle in your house, red, white, and blue, Star Spangled Banner flying American.
America.
Even if you were someone like that and you saw Dempsey, who is like, very much American, he's super violent and don't take no crap from nobody. Even if you saw, him as an American, you couldn't help but laugh because while that is a stereotype of Americans, you can also just see how ridiculous it is that he is that intense about it. And I think that's true of all the other caricatures in the game, to the point where if you were, Russian and you happen to like vodka, if you saw Nikolai drinking his, life away, you'd be like, oh, he's, this is obviously like blown way out of proportion, and anybody who sees this would recognize how blown out of proportion it is. So I think that's kind of how they got away with it, because you can't get mad at that. That's obviously not realistic. Nobody's going to think it is.
I think also just that it was very comedy based. Like, you weren't supposed to take a lot of things seriously, so you kind of get away with things that would maybe be rather offensive in other stories where people usually get mad. But because this was, meant to be more funny and it's, shoot 'em up action game, and then all those characteristics of them, is more endearing.
Yeah. Number number one rule of comedy is you're allowed to be offensive, but your joke has to be funnier than it is offensive. So, I mean, considering that they were pretty dang funny in their own rights, people just, don't mind all the other stuff about it. I mean, Rick Toffin, one of the characters, is a literal Nazi, but he's interesting.
And he's actually most people's favorites, as awful as that sounds, but
Yeah.
but he says like the most shocking things that it's like they're shocking and what's the right word? What's it called? Oh. So he's damn it. It's like he's shocking, but it appeals to a lot of dark humor, I feel like. And that's where I think it would tickle a lot of people. Surprisingly, I feel like most people playing it, if they had a favorite character, I feel like Rick Toffin and Nikolai were the two favorites. And Nikolai was dark in his own way, because, well, I mean, he has his drinking problems and he's had like a whole slew of wives, and many it sounds like he freaking killed them. It's like, well, doesn't he sound like a charming young man?
someone you could trust to bring your daughter home by 10, I'm sure.
Yeah, he's the kind of guy you want to introduce to your family on Thanksgiving Day.
Oh yeah, of course. Um, with that, I think that we have covered a lot of ground. As usual, we have rambled a bit. We've gotten a little bit off topic.
We went from Disney to, Nazi zombies, because that's normal.
Yeah, as you do. Feel free to join us next week when we discuss
Something.
something.
Something more about writing.
Something having to do with writing. Yes, of course, of course. Join us next week when we discuss what you try to accomplish with your writing and how you go about doing it. I have been Michael.
And I have always been Deanna.
And this has been Writer's Ramble. See y'all next time.
See ya.